So we've started working on our next series.
Yeah, you have.
I have.
Do you want to fill us in?
Sure. So it's on declarative rendering, which is like pretty abstract, pretty broad. But this there's a few reasons why we decided to go with this for our next series. I think we like to get into the bleeding edge of where our thinking is in the Ember world, in the front end world. And so we like to talk about things like functional CSS and Mirage and other Ember concurrency and things like this that we use. But it's easy to forget that folks are learning Ember every day, and folks are coming into companies for the first time, maybe with just a JavaScript background, or they've never used Ember for a long time. And so we want to make content for those folks as well. And also, it's like, we've talked about this a bunch, where you self-identify as like an intermediate or advanced developer, but then you hear Yehuda give a talk on like the fundamentals, and it's super interesting, and you always learn something from it.
Always.
Right? So I really like the idea of bouncing back and forth in terms of like the content that we produce, and just from an educational standpoint, between these bleeding edge things, which are exciting and fun. We were even talking about, and we'll get to this at the end, some of the questions that we were asked this week. And folks are always asking about, what just came out, what's on the cutting edge. But in our actual day-to-day work, whether we're mentoring and coaching folks, or working with a team or a client on a consulting project, new APIs are great, but 80 to 90% of the things that we fix or that we try to help folks with are just the fundamentals. Yeah. Like, you can get extremely far with the fundamentals of Ember. You don't need named blocks. You don't need Ember concurrency. I mean, we like those things. Ember concurrency.
I'm going to push back there. Yeah. I think Ember concurrency is a default install.
It's become pretty standard.
When we did the Ember concurrency series, that was a year and a half ago. Yeah. So I don't think it was as popular as it is now.
Agreed.
But yes.
Agreed. It has become basically a building block.
I just totally sidetracked this whole thing.
Okay. So most of the times when someone is having trouble, it's just because of a fundamental thing. It's, the extra things are there to solve problems. And eventually, like just what happened with Ember concurrency, those abstractions are good enough that they become the building blocks. But there's a lot of abstractions that aren't yet building blocks that folks tend to focus on, but the building blocks get you very, very far.
Yeah, I think if you're an advanced Ember developer, you're thinking a lot about what's up and coming.
Right.
What's in the new release, what are the newest add-ons, what are the newest patterns. That's what you're thinking about in the shower. But then when you're coding, it's 80% of the time it's fundamentals, bread and butter Ember. And this is especially true if you're a part of a team. Because if you're a part of a team, generally there's like one or two people that are really into Ember, and then 3 or 4 people that they're good Ember developers, but they're not going to meetups every night.
Right.
They're not watching every EmberConf talk.
Right.
And you want to be able to talk to those folks about the bread and butter stuff, and you don't want to distract them with stuff like engines and all the new up and coming features.
Right. You think about Ember in the shower?
Yes.
It's good to know. Would have been nice to know that before we went in business together. So
you didn't hear me like singing about components?
About component composition?
Yeah.
So the series is called Declarative Rendering. And the idea behind it is, it's funny because it's not really an API the way you need to learn how to use store.createRecord or store.save on a model. It's not an API that Ember provides, but it's the backbone for how Ember works. It's the reason, it's like the main value proposition of Ember's rendering layer. And it wasn't until we started talking about it and unpacking what it really meant that we understood how deep it goes.
Well, I remember we went out to dinner last week, and you had been researching this all day, coming up with this topic, and you were like, I've got it. It's declarative rendering. And I was like, okay, yeah, I think I know what declarative rendering is. And then you started explaining it, and I was like, wow, like when I was I just didn't know.
Yeah.
Like I knew what declarative rendering is. I felt like I could walk my way through it, talk my way through it. I knew that I should be using handlebars. I know what declarative code looks like.
Right.
But like, dude, after, 2 minutes of you talking about it, I was like, wow, there is so much here there's so much here that like I knew, but I wouldn't be able to explain like that. And
Right.
that's one of the reasons I'm super excited for this.
Yeah, me too. Because I had the same moment just as I was trying to break it down. And, I think I think it's one of the most important things that's happened in the JavaScript community in like the last 5 or 6 years. React's website, Vue's website, Angular's website, Ember's website all have little snippets about this because it's such an important ingredient. And it's not something that was present in Backbone. Backbone doesn't have declarative rendering because it actually doesn't have rendering at all. Backbone's render function, if you remember, is a no-op. And it's up to you to decide when the data changes, you subscribe to the model changes and the collection changes in your Backbone app, how you're going to affect the screen output. And so it's up to you completely. And so you end up writing a lot of imperative code. And now all the major frameworks have a view layer, right? They have a rendering layer. And the question is, what's the best way to render output? And the answer that all of them provide is declaratively.
Do you think this series, like you watch a series as an Ember developer, but you'll be able to apply some of the fundamentals to React and Angular? And
absolutely. Just like, we had a series talking about what we call smart and dumb components, and I've even seen those terms come up in other communities. And we always have this question like, we could make this more generic, but I think teaching it to an Ember audience using the Ember component that we're all familiar with is the best way to learn it as an Ember developer. But absolutely, if you watch this and then you had to also do work on a React app, you're thinking about the same stuff. I mean, Michael Jackson from React Training actually has a video, a meetup talk he gave recently. It was called Making the DOM Declarative. And he's talking about some of these ideas. So
Nice.
I think it absolutely applies. And it's something that the frameworks provide for us at a low level for the basic stuff, like what to put in between this H1 tag and how to make sure it stays in sync with our data. But the interesting part is that what we don't realize is that we render lots of things in our apps and the framework can't do it all for us. This is why we end up making components and we make custom functions that affect the visual output of our apps. And oftentimes we're thinking imperatively when we dive into those levels.
Oh, absolutely. And not only that, some of the APIs that we're working with, like the browser APIs, are imperative APIs.
Right.
So we're nudged when we look up the documentation, we're nudged towards, we don't even know it, but we're just nudged towards thinking in an imperative way.
Exactly. How do I play a video?
Yeah. Video.play.
Yep. So, this came up in the D3 series. It was these kind of little teachable moments throughout building the chart. Right, the D3 series was not really about building a chart, even though we build a chart throughout the whole thing. It's really about all these other things that are how to build an Ember component that happens to render a chart in its output, but should be thought about and constructed the same way as any other Ember component that would behave as other Ember developers expect. And so it's kind of fun now that we have this whole series that we can just focus on that aspect and really unpack it. So.
Nice.
Yeah, so we should have, I think it'll be about 4 or 5 videos, and it should be done. We'll have the first video out. Today is on the site. Tomorrow or next week, we'll have the second part, which is a big chunk of it. And then kind of wrapping up the principles and then go through an example of, okay, I understand this and maybe I thought that I follow this rule. Here's an example of something, a mistake, a part of your app that's imperative and you didn't even know it, and how to apply the lessons of declarative rendering to that thing.
I love that when we were talking about this series, we were looking for examples and we're kind of like, well, we're Ember developers. We do declarative rendering everywhere. And then we go through a few of our apps and it's like, oh, there's an imperative example. There's another one. There's another one.
Yep.
Like, there's just so many places that you're not even realizing that you're not doing declarative rendering.
Yep.
And to be fair, Ember is pushing you in the right direction.
Yes.
But yeah, it's very easy for these things to slip through.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, once you are writing JavaScript, you can do whatever you want. It's unconstrained. And so you just do what feels easy and natural, right? But if you can take the constraints of Ember's layer and say, how can I fit my code into these constraints, things like using handlebars variables, then you are nudged in the right direction. But yeah, we had an issue on our site that was related to this.
Yes. Yep.
And we've talked about this in the podcast before. This was actually more related to declarative data fetching than declarative rendering. But the ideas are strikingly similar. The idea being, if you declare the needs of the output of a particular page, then the tooling can take care of unanticipated state changes for you. You don't have to think through all of the paths to arrive to this thing, or if something's changed, how it's going to affect it. And if you're able to declare the data needs for your app, then maybe Ember Data can take care of fetching the data you need. And in a similar way, if you're able to declare the visual needs of your components, then Ember can take care of re-rendering or updating those when they need to. So it's kind of interesting, but I think that they were really closely related.
Yeah, one of the things that always helps me is when we say, you want to describe the states of your app and not how to transition between states, but you just want to describe the states, and then you let Ember figure out the transitions.
Exactly.
Or you let the tool, the framework, figure out the transitions.
Yep.
And that's, it's shocking how many places that applies.
Yes.
Templating, data fetching, there's so many places.
Server sessions, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff, and it's, a traditional server rendered app, you get a fresh restart every time. So there's so many of these things that there might be mistakes you're making if you cracked open a server app that we wrote 10 years ago, but they're swept under the rug because you're turning it off and on again every single request.
Yeah. Yep.
So you don't have to think about
short-lived.
So many of these things. What happens if the backend changes after I've loaded this page? Well, it doesn't matter, because the next page you load, it's going to be a fresh one. So am I looking at stale data or fresh data right now? It doesn't matter, because the next page is going to be clean slate. But, as we move towards a world, and I think we'll talk about this during the question section, as we move towards a world where we're emulating more capabilities of native apps with things like service workers, making progressive web apps, making them work offline, all of these problems come right to the fore, and they have to be approached head on, right? That's why things like Orbit existing and tackling this head first is super important, because if you're making something that effectively is an application, is a native app, that can work offline and offline. You have multiple clients now sharing a single data source. You have to understand this stuff like cold.
Yeah.
So pretty interesting stuff. Keep your eyes out for that series that should be coming soon.
All right, what do we got next?
We want to talk about Ember versus X, and how we talk about Ember versus X, and how
Steelman
versus strawman.
Yeah.
So this is an idea I heard about it. Peter Thiel was giving a lecture, and he was talking about opposing points of views. He was talking about Silicon Valley and how it's kind of like it can be an echo chamber in some ways, and how it's easy when you're in an echo chamber, whether it's whatever. Silicon Valley is just an example, but it could be anything. Your Twitter bubble. It's easy to characterize the other side of something in a straw man way, which is like making straw man arguments. The idea there being arguments that are flimsy, that are not actually representative of the other side. And then you set that up, and then you take it down. And that helps you confirm your perspective.
You started this talking about, like Silicon Valley or Twitter bubble. But I mean, this happens everywhere. This totally happens in Ember. It probably happens in React and Angular, just
right.
these communities, and you're around Ember developers all day. You're making arguments for why you use Ember, and you don't have anyone there that's really arguing against it.
Right.
So you have to make the argument. If there's no one there actually making the argument for React, you have to play that role. So in your head, you have this voice of the person, what someone arguing React would say.
Right.
And I think as an Ember developer, you might not give that voice as much credit as it deserves.
Right. Right.
And this is a straw man versus Steelman.
So what Peter Thiel talked about was, instead of using straw man arguments for us to confirm our existing perspectives, what we should do is come up with Steelman arguments. So make the strongest case for the opposing viewpoint that you possibly can. And then if you're able to take it down, right, if you're able to argue against it in a compelling way, you should have more confidence in whatever you believe. And so as it applies to Ember, the idea there is like, if you're in a company and folks are deciding, a team needs to decide what to use for this next project, then you want to represent the Steelman arguments for everything, for every side.
Yep.
And so it's easy, I think. You can hear you've heard people say like, React is just a view layer, and Ember is great because it brings everything to the table. And because React is just a view layer, then you have to make all these decisions, and therefore we should use Ember.
The other one that was popular a few years ago. It's like JSX is ugly.
Right.
I shouldn't write JSX. This is
right.
like I should just write JavaScript in JavaScript.
Right.
It's funny that also on the other React developers will strawman Ember and say you shouldn't have templates and components in two separate files.
Right. As if that's what an Ember developer cares, like a day-to-day Ember developer is even thinking about or cares about.
Or that's what's like, that's why you would choose Ember is two separate files.
Right. Right. So, right, on both sides, you want to understand the Steelman argument. This reminds me of some old economists I've read before talk about Turing capability, where if you're thinking about an alternative side, then you're representing it. And being Turing capable in an argument means that folks who share that perspective would see you as belonging to their tribe. So he usually talks about this with like Republicans and Democrats, but it's the same idea. If I were making an argument as to why someone should use Ember, or if I think Ember is a good fit for a particular project, and then they say, well, should we use Vue? And then I'm going to say, well, Vue is, and then I say Vue is good at this is what its strengths are. If I'm saying that stuff, I should sound as if I'm almost part of the Vue community, because it means I actually understand it. I'm speaking about it the way Vue developers would.
Yeah.
And then if you say, given those arguments, that Steelman argument, that Turing capable argument, it's really kind of the same idea. Then if we say, but Ember's strengths are this, and in this particular case, these strengths are better than these strengths, or the weaknesses are not as important as these weaknesses, then you can be confident that the choice is right. And it makes me think of like Intercom. They use React for their messenger, and they use Ember for their dashboard, and that makes a lot of sense. Like the messenger is embedded on third-party websites. It's small. It doesn't need a router. Doesn't need all this stuff. I'm sure it's very complex, but that's just an example, right, of using the tool that's most appropriate. And that's ultimately what this comes back to. Like, we care about using the tool that's most appropriate, that's going to help teams make great products as fast as possible. And we want to suggest and make recommendations about things that are right.
So what's some way that, I don't hang out with Vue developers. I don't even think I know anyone know anyone personally, like not on Twitter, that's a full-time Vue developer.
Right.
And I know a couple React developers, but not many. So I don't have a lot of exposure to their best arguments. Mm-hmm. What's some of the ways that I can, like, should I just go into work and start arguing why React is better than Ember? Like, what are some of the ways that I can kind of flex my Steelman muscle?
That's a great question. I think, so just my first kind of reaction to this is, I think Twitter is a great way to vicariously live through people. I know when some of the folks who were first dabbling in React were coming from the Ember community, you can follow their experience and see what are the pros of using React. Where did they get things right? And what can Ember learn from them? And so I think I would be able to make an argument for, what are the strengths of React or of a library like Vue. Not everything, not the same way someone who's been using it every day for 2 years could, but I do think Twitter can be a really good way. So I think making sure to follow people on Twitter who are outside your bubble is really good. Watching conference talks from React or Vue conferences, or even server conferences, server frameworks. Like, I know we've been talking about Tailwind a lot lately, and Adam Wathan, the creator, is in the PHP community. So this is the first time I've been really interested in recent years in a technology with like a big overlap with the PHP community, just because I haven't written a lot of PHP lately at all. And so you see some of his viewpoints coming through. And when he was talking about how to use Tailwind, and if you were doing like a front end only framework like an Ember app or a React app, he had some ideas about what API he would want. The reason he made Tailwind is so that it can be used everywhere. And then he said something like, yeah, I feel like the what's the term he used? Like the blinder vision in the React community, or what he really meant by that was like the front end JavaScript community. Mm-hmm. Like the blinders about that this is the way everyone's making apps is really strong. In reality, folks who aren't doing the kind of stuff we're doing every day are making apps in completely different ways. Websites, the way people have always made websites.
There's still plenty of rendered server rendered HTML out there.
Exactly, and people who aren't thinking about state all day or whatever. And so it's good to hear those perspectives of those folks too, and how how the complexity we introduce through different things affects that. So anyways, that was kind of in the weeds, but just I think there's lots of ways you can expose yourself to people with different perspectives, and I think that's true for lots of life, not just tech circles. But I also think using a tool is a good way to learn about it. And like when React came out and then Glimmer came out, and we've dabbled with these in side projects to get a feel for them. And again, there's no substitute for using something every day for 2 years, but that's another good way to get a sense for it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember using Create React App for the first time and being blown away by some of the decisions that they made.
Right.
And loving it.
Right.
And those are things that I wouldn't have been able to make those arguments had I never used it.
Right.
I need that experience.
Right.
So.
I also think another important aspect of this is, saying something like Ember is annoying because it separates templates and JavaScript files, or React is annoying because it uses JSX. Like, those things are facts in isolation, but how do those affect your particular team? So is your team composed of 3 or 4, expert JavaScript developers who have their toes dipped in the community all day, every day? Or is your team like one person and a lot of designers with a traditional background who know HTML and CSS? Like, those things really matter. And those different aspects of the frameworks affect different teams differently. So if you're talking about what's the best argument for this thing, and this reminds me of like Basecamp, the advice that comes there from DHH and their team. They have a luxury of really advanced programmers who think deeply about this stuff. It's a small team.
Yep.
Small team with really, really strong programmers. And not every company has the luxury of that. A lot of companies need help, and they are looking for, any kind of developer and hoping that they can train them up. But it's not, there's not an infinite supply of extremely thoughtful, dedicated programmers. And so that's another thing to consider. Like, some tools are more suitable for folks who are like dedicated craftsmen or whatever, and some are more for enabling people who aren't.
I mean, this goes back to something you said earlier, but it's you compare the weaknesses and the strengths given the best argument.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think it's good for us to keep in mind when we talk about other technologies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What do you want to do? Questions?
Yeah. So we want to answer some questions from folks we asked on Twitter, we asked in Slack, and so let's just kick this off. We had 2 questions about engines, actually, and given our extensive engines experience, I think it was great for us to answer them here. So first one is, I care about lazy loading Ember code like routes. My knowledge is that it's only possible with Ember engines, but I'm not sure. And then someone just asked generally kind of the status of Ember engines and what I should think about them. So yeah, we haven't really done a ton with engines. We haven't.
I mean, I haven't done anything.
I've used an in-repo engine once. I think engines had a big push for a specific use case, and there has been some development lately. I don't think it's quite where the folks working on it would like it to be in terms of polish. But I have heard of teams using it with success. The main use case that they were first created for was literally reducing payload size of a shipped app. So it wasn't even it wasn't even, it was literally that the developers, it was a combination of developers being able to work on submodules of the app without having to have everything working. And then also when you ship the code for the homepage, it doesn't have to load all 10 modules. So my first gut reaction is like, if you're not having this problem where your bottleneck is like the code that you're shipping which I don't think most apps probably do. It's probably more like data loading is a way lower hanging fruit, like optimizing network requests or being smart about how your UI is rendering progressively or like fetching secondary data lazily. I think those are much lower hanging fruits than going like an engine's route.
Yeah, I agree. I've never worked on an app where we needed to reach for engines.
Right.
And I worked on plenty of apps where the idea of using engines comes up.
Right.
And it's like you said, usually when you get at what does this enable, there's an easier way to solve the problem.
Yeah. But at the same time, going back to the Steelman arguments, I think it would be good for us to to speak to some companies that have gone all in on it and see what their experience is, just because we don't have that deep experience working with engines. The other thing I will say recently, one of the features of engines is that you can mount them. And so a host app can mount an engine at a namespace. And this came up when I was working on add-on docs. So add-on docs basically provides an app for your dummy app to render. I mean, your dummy app ends up using add-on docs to create like a whole application, but there's lots of assumptions that add-on docs needs to make about the host app in terms of how it's getting its data and what's being rendered at certain URL endpoints. And what we've found as we've worked on it, me, Dan, and Chris, is there's no real good way for an add-on to just reach into a parent app's router and like add routes. I've also ran into this on Tailwind. Tailwind add-on will add a style guide at /Tailwind. So those kinds of things, because the host app's router is global, there's a global namespace, right? There's like a single router file. So imagine you start installing add-ons and they all are just writing to global routes. They're not a good situation.
In and throwing their own routes there.
Exactly. So that's a recipe for collision. So the idea with mountable engines is that I'm providing you this functionality, and then you, the host app, get to say, okay, mount this at /docs.
Okay.
And so just like in Rails has engines for things that the engine shouldn't just guess about where it can throw something and then just eagerly do that. It makes sense for the host app to say, okay, put Sidekick here, under my auth scheme or not.
In this namespace. In this
namespace or
URL structure. Yep.
Exactly. So I think that that's an aspect of engines that is very useful when I think about the kind of functionality that add-ons can provide. So like Ember SVG jar provides like a page at /Ember SVG jar, where it lets you preview all the SVGs that it compresses and like shows you how to use them. But it's made in a really like ad hoc way. It should just be able to render Ember components and have the host say, yep, throw it there, or throw it at /style guide or whatever.
What does that look like? Does that look like you going into the router and mounting an engine?
Yeah, you just call this .mount and then you give it a name of an engine.
Does it use your application template? Does it have its own application template?
I think it would use your application template because it would be a route underneath it.
So with style guide stuff.
Yeah, you don't want it to use the application.
Because now you have your application Chrome, your app shell, whatever we're going to call it.
Right. I think that's a separate problem. I think there's another thing there where either you have some way to toggle that, or right now in Ember CLI Tailwind, I do something super hacky. I like swap out the application template in the container if you happen to be visiting /Tailwind, so that we can just give you a blank slate. But I think there's other ways you could do it. 2 sibling routes at the top, one that holds your application and then one that doesn't. But that might affect your name. Like maybe you can do it in a way that doesn't affect all the names of the route. I'm not sure.
So that would be really exciting if you could do it in a way where you didn't have to pay the cost of adding a new route name to like every link to.
Right, exactly. So, but yeah, so anyways, going back to like how would a docs provide a /docs or a /API route to your thing? I think the idea of an engine being able to do that is really nice. And, the problem is that engines have all of these features associated with them. Lazy loading, code splitting, mounting, all these different things. And there's a lot of complexity there. Just like with fastboot, it's not as easy as installing fastboot and getting going. So engines the same thing. Like you're introducing new layers of complexity into your app and you're going to have to deal with it in unexpected ways. So that's why our general recommendation is really let's make sure that there's no easier way to solve the problem you have before adding one of these things. But the idea of having engines that are just that part, like providing an isolated piece of the app that you can mount, and they're not adding any other complexity, is really nice. They just provide that isolation. And, Dan Freeman was saying it's easier than it looks. It's easier than you might think to do that. So like we're talking about making add-on docs an engine. So it's an add-on, but it's also an engine. And so when you use it, like if I were to use add-on docs to document Mirage, I would install it and then I would mount it at like either root or /docs or something. And that way add-on docs gets to make lots of nice assumptions about having ownership over that sub tree of the route.
Nice.
And it can do a lot of magical things that doesn't interfere with the app in other ways.
I mean, that sounds pretty great for
global routes or global models, for example. Like add-on docs has models that it provides, and now you can isolate them. And
I was going to say that sounds pretty great for existing add-ons that already have their own doc site, that already have their own dummy app code. That way they can introduce add-on docs at a subroute and not have to worry about, this global stuff that's going on.
Exactly. So I think because you're talking about merging things with a global namespace area, a shared namespace like the router, then I think there's a strong use case for it. I just don't know what the process looks like today, given the development of engines, because I just know that there's also other features that the engines team folks are working on, right? They're talking about code splitting and all this stuff. So that's something that we should keep an eye out for. But I think within this year it'll get much better, the experience. I think it already has gotten much better than when it first came out. I know there were some rough edges, but I think more and more folks are using it. So yeah, we should reach out to some teams who are using it.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool. So let's go to the next question. Is it time to pitch progressive web apps instead of native apps for clients wanting a presence on mobile? And this is regarding the latest Safari release.
So Safari for both Mac and iOS added a service worker.
Yep.
So, and this was one of the key things needed for PWAs.
Yeah, I remember when Dockyard put out their progressive web app, and they were talking about it would just work, and then it would break in Safari because they kept changing, and it wasn't stable, but it was working in all the other browsers. So the fact that Safari came out and didn't kill it like they killed Flash, it's really good because there's a lot that's gone into, and there's a lot of investment that's already gone into making progressive web apps work. So talk about Service Worker. What is it?
Yeah, so Service Worker is it's a proxy, some JavaScript code that runs on the client, runs on the browser, and it acts as a proxy between your front end and your back end. So before you make an API request, it's going to go through the Service Worker. Before you even
make an asset request
for the
index.html.
Yeah, for an image. It's all going to go through the Service Worker. So this gives you a place where you can control
how your app responds and works, regardless of the actual true network connection.
And it's with JavaScript code. So you can write JavaScript code to control all this. And it's, it uses promises, right? It returns promises. So it's, feels modern.
Right. Seems super exciting.
Yeah.
Right. So this is like, you can do offline-ish stuff. I mean, this is the big thing it enables, right, is offline apps. And it does a lot of other stuff too. I mean, more sophisticated caching strategies are enabled because of it. But really, if you open a normal website right now and it's your internet is offline, you're on a plane, you're just going to get a screen that says no internet connection.
The dinosaur.
Right, the dinosaur. But again, when I opened up like dockyard.com on the plane and I had no internet, I was able to use the whole site. I got to one part where it was like, it seems like you don't have an internet connection. And it's like so cool because you're just using an app offline. And just like you would with a native app, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's why it's important, is because if you really want, it's like the uncanny valley we talk about, where something tries to emulate something else, but it does it in a way that's not quite right, and then it just feels worse.
Yeah.
So it's like a website that tries to emulate an app. You add it to the home screen, and you add, fixed navigation along the footer, and you remove the Chrome from Safari so that when you're using it, like the meta tag that removes it and gives it an icon, and you use it and it feels like an app. But then in situations like where you have bad network connections or it's off, you can't open it like an app, or it doesn't save data like an app would. That's that uncanny valley. So that's a really bad spot. And the Service Worker really enables you to kind of bridge that. I mean, that's the hope.
I think going back to the question, is now the time to pitch it over native apps. I don't know if this is a tech question. Like, I don't know if APIs will answer yes or no for this. I think this depends on your team, what you're building. So if you have a small team, let's say you have like 2 developers and you need to make a native app experience that works for both iOS and Android, then I would say, yeah, Service Worker looks pretty attractive here.
Right.
PWA looks really attractive.
Right.
But to say that all native apps should stop and start writing PWAs, it's like, okay, if you have dedicated teams,
Yeah,
There's some pretty nice APIs that exist.
Yeah.
When you're writing a native app.
Yeah, you're making a startup around AR that's going to use ARKit or something like that.
Yeah.
You don't want to make it an Ember PWA.
Yeah, could you even do that?
Yeah, probably not. I think the PWA case is really nice for, we have a friend who has a startup and they have an Ember app, and then they needed it to work well on mobile devices because folks were in locations where they only had their access to their mobile. And you can use responsive design. You can use local storage. There's a long way you can get to push it to where you don't need that native app anymore. And I feel like that's just like we talk about going bottom up in code where you don't prematurely abstract. That's a really nice use case for these PWAs. Starting from the beginning, making something just a PWA and saying we're never going to need a native app. I mean, I don't know if you can ever really say that just because you might want to eventually get that native app for a variety of reasons. But the more features we get like Service Worker, the more it bends that curve. And,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't really have a dog in that hunt in terms of one day will the web completely overthrow native. I mean, there's a lot of native apps I like. There's a lot of things cool things that they can do, capabilities of the hardware that they can take advantage of. But I definitely am a believer in the power of the web. I mean, it's super powerful. We're doing more with it than we ever have before. And so it's awesome to see a consensus among browser vendors and the folks writing the JavaScript engines for landing all this cool stuff.
Yes.
So, and then let's see, maybe one more question. How might writing Glimmer components be different in the coming months as we unlock that as first class through the eyes of a traditional Ember developer? So I think this question is asking if I'm using Glimmer or if I have some Glimmer code, how might that change? Or how might Glimmer components change now that the team is focused on upstreaming Glimmer into Ember? We've written some standalone Glimmer code, but not much. But obviously the APIs from Glimmer were written and designed with an intention of fitting into the Ember model, like the whole pattern of writing Ember apps. I took a look at the status board on the Ember.js website for some of the RFCs that are being worked on. The ES classes are in implementation, so using ES classes instead of ember.component.create. The Ember Glimmer compatibility is being worked on. Module unification is being worked on. Named blocks are being worked on. So I think those are all things that are bleeding over from Glimmerland into Ember. But yeah, my understanding is that, I mean, Glimmer is separate, but once they're merged, the idea will be to have a seamless experience between those two. And then eventually we'll be writing Glimmer components in our Ember apps, but they'll basically be the same thing.
I think like on the service level, we're going to see some syntax changes. Like I think the class syntax or the class syntax.
That's
a perfect example.
The @ syntax to distinguish between arguments that are passed in and local properties in the component. I know they were talking about private properties on the class. So, how those will be marked and whether those will be available in the template or not is another change that could come.
Interesting. I think that stuff, like the surface level stuff, will change, but from how we think about building Ember apps and how we think about components, I think the higher level stuff is none of that's going to change.
Yeah, I agree. The principles for writing good Ember components are going to apply to writing good Glimmer components and vice versa.
I'm not worried at all, and I don't know if this question is coming from a place of concern, but I'm not worried at all about oh no, like I have to relearn all this stuff because Glimmer's coming.
Totally.
Just, normal Ember is normal. Ember is, what's the term I'm looking for here?
The stability without stagnation. Yeah. You just know that, the core team has our backs, right? They're gonna do it one piece at a time. There's gonna be an upgrade path, and there's gonna be probably a code mod that does it for us. So that's really cool. And then just to wrap up, someone asked, again, it's kind of like one of the recurring questions, but it's about Ember Data and how it can be hard to use it if you don't have a JSON API backend that's well structured. I mean, we used Ember Data for a long time without any JSON API backend.
Yeah.
But that's because also we were using, the Rails backend that worked well with the stock Ember Data.
I mean, we were using Ember Data before JSON API existed.
Yeah. But I think we've also always mostly been in situations where the backend is more under our control. And so we're able to make decisions that standardize it in a way that it makes it easier to write the transforms on the front end side.
I think one of the reasons that, okay, so this question, like it's saying like, how can you use Ember Data when you don't have a standard backend? And it's kind of acknowledging that JSON API makes it easy to use Ember Data because of the standard.
Yeah.
And you get to draw a really nice boundary.
Yeah.
You get to say like, these are the things the backend will provide. These are the things the front end will provide. And there's a point. There's like, imagine you have front end, back end teams, you draw a line through them. There's a very clear point where how things interact. And so I think if you're not using Ember Data or JSON API, you can still have that.
Right.
You just need to have those boundaries.
Right.
So if every single API endpoint is a discussion for how it's going to be built, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
I think you want to.
It's going to be a problem even if you were slinging your own front end code.
Yeah.
And you didn't have an abstraction like Ember Data. I mean, I don't want to be dismissive, and I understand that working with Ember Data is hard if you have to transform things.
Not at all. But what I'm saying is I think JSON API provides very good structure and very good boundaries. You can not have as good structure in your documents, but you can still provide those boundaries. So you can say all relationships are going to look like this.
Right.
Maybe they're not perfect, and maybe there's situations where there's a bug.
Right.
But that's going to make working with Ember Data a lot easier.
So let's be practical, or just kind of, if you were in a situation like that where you had a backend that was all over the place, what would you do?
So I think I would first try to change it at the backend layer.
Yeah.
So modifying code, creating like a V2 API. If I didn't have control over the backend, I'd probably use the adapter layer I would use Ember Data's adapter and serialized layer to restructure the data. And I would try to get it in the shape of JSON API.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm tempted to say as well, is like, I've done this before. I have done this before, working with some kind of off the cuff node backend that was just emitting WebSocket events, and it was just happened to be a shape of whatever we wanted, or whatever the backend developer wanted, and so it wasn't like a JSON API document. And so the question is how to get that into the store. And what I ended up doing was I had a layer in the app that I wrote a bunch of tests against. These were the kinds of events I got, and I transformed them and pushed them in the store and made sure when I got this event, I ended up with this in the store, right? These days, I'm tempted to think that really what you want is to have a layer that, like you were saying, turns the payload into a JSON API document, because then you can go to town on that thing, write all sorts of test cases covering all the different shapes of payloads you get. And I really feel like there's a tool here too. I feel like there's a tool that can take a crazy payload that helps folks who need to turn payloads into JSON API standard documents and verify those documents. That feels like a separate problem to me. It feels like you want to work on that separate from your app. You want that thing to exist and be well tested so that when you're building your app, it's as if you have a JSON API backend.
Yeah, so you have backend, a transform, and then front end.
Yes.
So I agree with this. I don't, part of me gets worried when I hear this, where I think, front end developer is going to go off and spend all this time writing those transforms, when it might have been easier investing time in convincing the backend team.
Well, certainly. I agree with that. I mean, that's why that was your first response, right? It's just have a conversation with the backend team and make sure you have the good ammunition, because this is going to be something that really, really slows the team down.
Yeah, I'm really
reticent to recommend or to just go down that path.
It feels like reaching for the technical solution,
right?
And yeah,
when it's really a communication solution.
I've been there. Like, there's times you have to do it.
Yeah.
There's no other option.
Well, let's just say you're working with an external API, for example.
Yeah. Yes, that's the ultimate case of this third-party API that you don't control. Right. No one in your organization controls.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So if you were in that situation, you need a transform layer of some sort. And yeah, my recommendation would be, of course, I mean, Ember Data offers a layer to do that. The adapter and serializer layer lets you customize all aspects of that, but there's just a few hooks, and you want to go about it systematically. So again, like the app that I worked on, I ended up making basically a service class to do this, that I was able to just break down with lots of different methods and some collaborating objects and write tests against. And that helped me think about it, the whole problem, and made sure that the network layer data transform wasn't something I had to think about.
And you can draw a circle around that layer, and it's not tied to your app.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's great.
So I think that's, if you absolutely have to, that's a path I would go down. But I think your advice is really good, and to understand that if this is within a team, within a company, a single organization, that really this is a communication thing, and it's, there's going to be tension when you have the front end and back end folks who want to do things their own way, and that's why a standard is so important. It's so good. You can just say we buy into it, and that way, it's like having a bot comment on style guide violations on your open source project. You don't need to be nitpicking and have this.
Right. You don't have to feel like you're throwing away that like capital that you've built up by commenting that this line is 81 characters.
Yes.
Yeah, that's why you want the bot.
Yep, exactly. So I think that's what we'd recommend for that, and it is hard. So our hearts are with the developers in those places where they're working with those APIs that they have no control over, because I know that can be a time sink for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I would, when I'm in those places, I think you don't have to go in there and deliver a home run pitch for why the company should use JSON API. That's that's the wrong approach. I think what you do is you go out and you grab coffee, beer, lunch with one backend developer. And if you can convince one person that you should be using JSON API, and you get them excited about JSON API, you just cut the battle in half.
Yes,
now you have
an advocate on the back end, which is what you want.
Yeah, and you just keep doing it. And that's how I've gotten JSON API into organizations.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've had success with this, so it's not impossible. Yep. So I definitely think that should be the first reach, and also reminds me how fortunate we are that we control our own back end.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the real answer.
Right. You're
working on an app where you can control the back end. Awesome. Well, I think that's it for today. Thanks for listening. And if you're interested in following our work, you can subscribe to our newsletter at embermap.com/newsletter. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.